Before Egypt had kings, before its deserts turned to gold, there may have been something else, something older. Beneath the sand of Giza lies a puzzle that has never truly been solved. The Great Pyramid aligns perfectly to true north. The Sphinx shows the scars of forgotten rain, and no ancient text describes how these monuments were built. Were they the first creations of Egypt, or the last survivors of a world erased by time? Tonight, we follow the quiet trail of stone, erosion, and alignment to ask a question that history still avoids. What if Egypt didn't build its wonders, but inherited them? From flooded landscapes to vanished star maps, we'll trace the shadow of a civilization that came before memory itself. Settle in, let the desert fall silent. This is Egypt before Egypt, told in the still language of stone. The forgotten blueprints. In the dry silence of the Giza plateau, the Great Pyramid stands motionless. Its stones do not tell stories. They wait. The common belief says it was built around 2560 BCE for Pharaoh Khufu during Egypt's 4th dynasty. Yet the deeper archaeologists dig, the more this neat timeline begins to tremble. Some say Egypt did not build these monuments at all, that they were found, inherited, and reused by a civilization lost to time. The earliest records describing Giza come not from the builders, but from those who merely saw the pyramids. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, claimed that Khufu forced thousands of men to labor for decades. But Herodotus lived over 2,000 years after the supposed construction. He relied on temple priests, oral tales, and fading inscriptions. His story, while detailed, reads more like inherited memory than first-hand account. No contemporary Egyptian text clearly describes the building of the Great Pyramid. There are no blueprints, no construction logs, no names of architects, only stones, 2.3 million of them. The oldest Egyptian writings we have, like the pyramid texts found at Saqqara, appear long after Khufu's reign. They mention gods, not workers. They describe doors to the stars, stairways to the sky, and voices of the dead rising toward Orion. The pyramids were already old by then, ancient even to the ancient Egyptian. The erosion on the Sphinx adds another layer. In the 1990 seconds, geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University examined the Sphinx enclosure and noticed deep, rounded weathering patterns, erosion not from sand, but from heavy rain. Egypt's last era of sustained rainfall ended around 7000 to 5000 BCE. If the Sphinx was carved before that, it would predate the known Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. Most Egyptologists rejected this idea, but the marks remain visible, stubborn against the desert wind. Nearby, at Nabta Playa, in the Nubian desert, archaeologists Fred Wendorf and Romuald Schild uncovered an ancient stone circle aligned with the summer solstice. Radiocarbon dating placed it between 4800 and 4200 BCE. That is before the unification of Egypt. These people tracked the stars, marking Sirius and Orion's belt, the same stars the Giza pyramids would later echo in their layout. It suggests that the knowledge of celestial alignment existed long before Khufu's architects ever touched limestone. Legends preserved in the writings of Arab chroniclers, like al-Masudi and al-Idrisi, describe a time before the flood, when a king named Surid built the pyramids to preserve wisdom from an age about to vanish. Inside, he placed scientific records, astronomical tables, and maps of the stars. These tales were written in the 10th and 12th centuries CE, yet they echo themes from far older Mesopotamian and Sumerian myths of floods, destruction, and civilizations preserving knowledge in stone. Even Plato, in Timaeus and Critias, retold a story from Egyptian priests about an earlier civilization, Atlantis, destroyed by water around 9600 BCE. The date matches the end of the last ice age, when rising seas reshaped the coastlines of the world. The same era left traces of sudden climate shifts across North Africa, turning once green plains into the Sahara. If a culture thrived before this change, its ruins could have been swallowed by sand and time. The precision of the Great Pyramid seems unusual for its supposed period. Its base deviates from true north by less than 4 arc minutes. The ratio of its height to perimeter mirrors 2 pi, linking it to a circle's geometry. Each corner's orientation compensates for the Earth's curvature. Engineers still debate how such measurements were achieved with copper tools and cord. When modern surveyors like Flinders Petrie measured the monument in the 1,880 seconds, they found tolerances of less than 1/50th of an inch between massive limestone blocks. No ancient texts explain this accuracy. Some researchers, such as engineer Christopher Dunn, propose that the Great Pyramid's inner chambers show signs of machining or acoustic design. The so-called Grand Gallery resonates at specific frequencies. The king's chamber walls, made of rose granite, contain traces of high heat discoloration, as though exposed to powerful energy. Dunn argued it functioned not as a tomb, but as a form of resonant device, perhaps a power generator or sonic chamber. Egyptologists dismiss this as modern imagination. Yet the question lingers: why build such a vast monument for a single burial when no mummy was ever found inside? Satellite surveys have revealed faint patterns beneath the sand straight lines, buried foundations, and geometrical layouts extending beyond the known pyramid field. Infrared imaging by the University of Alabama in 2011 identified 17 lost pyramids and over 1,000 tombs hidden under the surface. Many appear older than the dynastic necropolises nearby. They could be earlier experiments or remnants of something forgotten. Beneath the Giza plateau itself, there are tunnels and chambers not yet mapped. In 1978, during the restoration of the Sphinx, workers discovered sealed passages descending under its pores. Egyptian authorities later restricted further excavation, citing safety reasons. In 1993, an American team, using ground-penetrating radar, detected voids under the Great Pyramid, large cavities with no known access points. Zahi Hawass, the director of antiquities, confirmed the anomalies but refused permission for drilling. He stated that some mysteries should remain. Ancient Egyptian texts sometimes refer to a place called Zep Tepe the first time. It describes an era when gods ruled on earth before the reign of mortal kings. The gods, in these texts, were not metaphors. They were described as beings who lived among humans, teaching writing, measurement, and architecture. When they departed, they left behind temples and monuments, in the manner of the gods. Later dynasties imitated these works, carving their own inscriptions onto older stone. The pyramids themselves bear few original carvings, suggesting they were already sacred before the dynasties began. Archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie once wrote that the skill and accuracy of the pyramid builders is astonishing. It leaves one with the impression that this civilization sprang fully developed, without the slow evolution expected. He meant it as admiration, not speculation. Yet it underlines a question: how does a civilization begin with perfection and then decline? To imagine Egypt inheriting the pyramids is to accept a gap in history, a silence between ages, a lost civilization, perhaps coastal, erased by floods or desertification. Its knowledge absorbed by survivors who settled along the Nile, carrying fragments of memory. The early dynasties could have built around what they found, reusing the monuments as sacred centers, reinterpreting them through new religion and language. When night falls on Giza, stars pass quietly above the limestone faces. The belt of Orion still aligns with the 3 pyramids. The air cools, the desert contracts. The monuments wait, as if aware that time like sand, only hides, never erases. The watermarks beneath the desert. When sunlight first touches the Sphinx, the rock around it glows pale gold. But when you walk closer, and your eyes adjust to the shadow of its enclosure, you can see something the desert shouldn't have left behind, curves carved not by sand, but by water. The walls ripple and roll like shorelines. For decades, those lines were seen as weathering from wind. Then, in the late 20th century, geologists began to notice that they matched the patterns of rainfall erosion, instead rain that hasn't touched this part of Egypt for thousands of years. In 1991, a team led by Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University was invited by Egyptologist John Anthony West to examine the Sphinx's surface. Schoch was not a fringe theorist, but a trained geologist used to reading the language of rock and sediment. What he saw unsettled him. The undulating vertical fissures on the limestone enclosure were inconsistent with the sharp horizontal flaking typical of desert wind erosion. Instead, they resembled the rounded grooves carved by repeated exposure to running water, centuries of heavy rainfall. He concluded that the original carving of the Sphinx could date to at least 7000 BCE, or even earlier, before Egypt became the dry land we know today. Egyptologists resisted this suggestion immediately. The official dating of the Sphinx ties it to Pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BCE, based on a partially damaged statue found near the causeway linking the Sphinx to his pyramid. But Schoch's analysis implied that the monument might have already been ancient when Khafre ruled, and that his masons merely restored or recarved the head. If true, then the civilization capable of shaping a monument of such scale would have existed long before dynastic Egypt, a culture whose traces are otherwise lost beneath millennia of desert drift. Geological evidence across North Africa supports the idea of a once green Sahara. During the period known as the African Humid Phase, between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, the desert was a mosaic of lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Satellite scans from NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission in the early 2000s revealed buried river channels stretching hundreds of kilometers under the sand, ancient tributaries that once flowed toward the Nile. Fossilized fish remains and hippo bones have been found near Dakhla and Karga oases. The environment that shaped the Sphinx's enclosure could only have existed in this wetter age. Archaeologists working near the Fayum Basin, southwest of Cairo, uncovered Neolithic villages with pottery shards, fish hooks, and traces of farming dated to 6000 BCE. These people lived in an Egypt that looked more like modern Sudan than today's Giza, a place of rainfall and vegetation. To carve the Sphinx from solid limestone bedrock, they would have needed tools of copper or harder materials and organized labor. None of this matches the scattered hunter-gatherer picture usually drawn for that era. Yet the stones seem to whisper of hands far more capable than we imagine. The Sphinx is carved directly from the plateau itself, not assembled from blocks. Its head, though proportionally small, is of denser limestone than the eroded body. The change in scale has long puzzled engineers. Some suggest the head was reshaped from an older lion form into the likeness of a pharaoh. This idea gained quiet support from structural anomalies. The neckline is too high and the head too narrow compared to the torso's erosion depth. The face could have been recarved during the Old Kingdom, its original identity erased under royal iconography. In 1926, Émile Barrès, a French engineer working for the Egyptian Antiquities Service, excavated deep trenches around the Sphinx to clear centuries of sand. His notes mention water-cut channels at the base, but the observation was set aside, overshadowed by his restoration work. It would take another 70 years before radar imaging confirmed subsurface cavities beneath the monument. Some of these voids appear to align with fissures filled by compacted sediment traces of ancient drainage. At the nearby Sphinx Temple, constructed from limestone blocks quarried from the Sphinx pit itself, the same pattern repeats. The stone faces bear the same vertical weathering as though exposed to rain before being removed from the bedrock. This temple, along with the Valley Temple of Kaf, displays an architectural precision far beyond the surrounding dynastic ruins. The megalithic blocks, some weighing over 200 tons, were fitted without mortar, smoothed and levelled in a way reminiscent of the granite walls of Machu Picchu or the terraces of Cusco worlds apart, yet curiously similar in craftsmanship. Satellite climatologists have traced the last great rainfall over northern Egypt to about 7,000 years ago. Around 5,200 BCE, the monsoon belt shifted south, ending the African humid phase. The lakes dried, the green plains died, and people retreated toward the Nile. Those who survived may have carried fragments of lost techniques, myths, and rituals, memories of stone lions and gods of the horizon. In later dynasties, the Sphinx was known as Horemheket, Horus of the horizon. It was already sacred, already old. When Napoleon's scholars surveyed Giza in 1798, the Sphinx was buried up to its neck in sand. Only its eyes were visible, staring across a wasteland. They recorded local legends claiming that beneath its paws lay entrances to halls filled with records of a vanished people. The Hall of Records became a subject of fascination in the 19th and 20th centuries, though no verified chamber has been entered. Yet even without myths, the geological truth tells a quieter story, that this landscape was not always a desert, and its oldest monuments may not belong to the Egypt we know. Core samples from beneath the Giza plateau reveal layers of compacted silt beneath the limestone crust. Microscopic pollen analysis from these cores shows traces of aquatic plant species that require standing water to survive. The patterns match those found in the Nile Delta's Holocene flood deposits. This suggests that Giza, long before it was a necropolis, stood near an ancient lake or seasonal floodplain. A civilization living beside it could have carved monuments in an era when the climate still favoured life. In 2019, a team from the University of Copenhagen analysed windborne dust trapped within the cracks of the Sphinx's enclosure. The mineral composition corresponded not to desert quartz, but to weathered sandstone particles typically carried by rainstorms, not dry winds. Their findings did not assign a new date, but quietly reinforced Schoch's earlier conclusion that water, not sand, shaped this monument's earliest scars. Today, the desert seems eternal. The sun burns where rivers once flowed. Tourists stand where rain once fell. The Sphinx gazes toward the east, where the sun still rises over what was once a sea of green. Its eroded shoulders and softened body may be less a mark of time than of climate, a fossil of weather, preserving a chapter from Earth's forgotten sky. The architects of the first time. In Egyptian texts, there is a phrase that appears often but is rarely explained. Zep Tepi, the first time. It was not a metaphor. It referred to an era before human kings, before dynasties, before even memory and age, when the gods themselves ruled on earth. To later scribes, these gods were not abstract symbols. They were beings who built, taught, and departed, leaving their temples behind. In the walls of the Temple of Edfu, carved during the Ptolemaic period but copying much older writings, priests recorded fragments of this lost history. They speak of a time when the islands of the egg were destroyed by flood and fire, and survivors known as the Shebtu, or the builders, sailed to a new land. There they reconstructed sacred sites according to the pattern of the original, guided by divine architects. Edfu's priests believed their temple was one such reconstruction, built on foundations that predated Egypt itself. These legends form the backbone of what later dynasties called the Age of the Gods. The names of these rulers were listed by the historian Manetho, a priest of Heliopolis, writing in the 3rd century BCE. He divided Egyptian history into 3 phases, the reign of the gods, the reign of the demigods, and the reign of mortal kings. In his chronology, the gods ruled for 13,900 years, followed by the demigods for another 11,000, before Menes unified the two lands around 3,100 BCE. The total span, almost 25,000 years, echoes the precession cycle of Earth's axis, as if their mythology was built on cosmic measurement. In the early dynastic temples of Heliopolis and Abydos, inscriptions refer to Thoth, the god of wisdom, as the one who measured the heavens and set the boundaries of the earth. He was credited with inventing writing, mathematics, and architecture, the very skills necessary to raise the pyramids. The priesthood believed Thoth's knowledge came from before the flood, a recurring phrase in Egyptian and Mesopotamian lore. The temples were built by the followers of Horus, wrote E.A. Wallace Budge in 1904, translating old papyri. They followed divine plans from Zep Tepe before the waters rose. When archaeologists excavated at Abydos, they found something peculiar: the Osirion, a subterranean temple of massive granite blocks, unlike any structure from its supposed era. The reign of Seti I, around 1290 BCE. Its megalithic style seemed older, resembling the Valley Temple near the Sphinx more than the ornate architecture of the New Kingdom. The Egyptologist Margaret Murray called it a work of the ancestors. Flinders Petrie described it as prehistoric in feeling. Seti's own temple stands above it, almost as if he built atop ruins whose builders he revered but did not know. Zep Tepe, then, was more than myth. It was a framework for memory, a way to explain monuments whose origins had already faded by the time of the pyramids. Even the priests of the Old Kingdom, reciting funerary texts inside tombs, spoke of the divine company in the sky who raised the primeval mound. They described the gods as beings of light who descended through shafts of air and water, setting down the first measurements of the world. The Great Pyramid's narrow shafts, precisely aligned to the stars of Orion and Sirius, mirror those same celestial references. In 1933, the Egyptologist Salim Hassan noted in his excavation report that early dynastic builders often reused foundations that were far older than the structures above them. There are instances, he wrote, where the base layers are of a different stone and technique, unrecorded in any inscription. The ancient Egyptians themselves must have found them here. The implication that Egypt's earliest architects inherited blueprints and foundations from an earlier age, quietly persisted in academic margins but never reached textbooks. The priests of Heliopolis preserved a tradition that the first temple, called Iunu, was designed to mirror the sky when the world was young. The concept of as above, so below the earthly reflection of heavenly order, guided much of Egyptian cosmology. The pyramid's alignment with Orion's belt and the Milky Way echoes this belief. The gods of the first time, they said, taught humans to replicate heaven on earth, to preserve balance between worlds. Modern archaeology traces Egypt's development to gradual shifts in farming, trade, and craft around 4000 BCE. Yet the precision of its earliest architecture appears abrupt, not evolved. There are no transitional monuments showing the trial and error that one would expect between mud brick tombs and the mathematical perfection of the Great Pyramid. Instead, mastery seems to appear whole, as though inherited knowledge had simply been reawakened. In 1996, a radar survey conducted by a French-Egyptian team near Abu Rawash, north of Giza, revealed buried walls forming concentric patterns beneath the sand. The structures predated known Old Kingdom remains. Nearby, fragments of diorite tools too hard to have been cut by copper chisels were found alongside pottery from a far later period. The site remains closed to the public. Local workers still call it the foundation of the gods. The same concept appears in Mesopotamia, where Sumerian king lists describe rulers before the flood, whose reigns lasted thousands of years. One name, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. Another, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200. The total sequence of divine kingship, 120 Sars, or 432,000 years, matches the precession cycles used later in Egyptian and Vedic cosmology. The repetition of these numbers across continents may reflect an inherited astronomical system, not coincidence. In the pyramid texts of Unas, carved around 2350 BCE, a single line stands out. The doors of the sky are opened for you. The stairway to the first time is set. The phrase stairway to the first time suggests that the act of burial was not merely to reach the afterlife, but to return to Zep Tepe, to reunite with the architects of the beginning. Some researchers, like Graham Hancock and John Anthony West, have proposed that Zep Tepe might encode real memories of an advanced Ice Age civilization destroyed by floods at the end of the Pleistocene, around 12,000 years ago. The melting of massive ice sheets then caused sea levels to rise by more than 100 meters, submerging coastal settlements worldwide. Archaeological discoveries at Gobekli Tepe in Turkey, dating to 9,500 BCE, show monumental architecture and astronomical alignment thousands of years earlier than Egypt. The builders of Gobekli Tepe carved pillars with animal reliefs and arranged them according to celestial patterns, an echo of the same knowledge attributed to the gods of Zep Tepe. In Egyptian myth, the world began when the primeval mound rose from the waters of chaos, and the god Atum stood upon it. He brought forth creation through thought and word. The priests of Heliopolis believed this mound was located at Giza, the first land to emerge after the flood. If so, the pyramids could have been built to mark that sacred geography long before the pharaohs adopted it as their own. Each dynasty retold fragments of the story, carving over older ones, until only symbols remained. The gods became kings, the kings became myths, and the builders of the first time became names without language. Yet in the alignment of stone to star, in the precision of forgotten hands, their presence still lingers quiet, anonymous, enduring. The lost machinery of stone. Inside the ancient quarries of Aswan, there is an unfinished obelisk lying half-carved from the granite bedrock. It measures 42 meters in length and weighs more than 1,000 tons. Its sides are smooth, its corners nearly perfect, and yet it was abandoned cracked before removal. Archaeologists call it a project interrupted by failure. Engineers see something stranger. Along its flanks are tool marks that curve like machine cuts, continuous and deep, as though the stone were planed rather than hammered. No copper chisel could carve such lines. Granite ranks among the hardest natural materials on Earth, and its shaping usually demands tools harder than steel. The early Egyptians, according to conventional history, had only copper. But copper blunts easily on granite. Experiments conducted by engineer Denise Stocks in the 1,990 seconds used replicas of ancient tools, copper saws and sand abrasives to test these theories. Even with modern methods, a simple groove required days of effort and constant resharpening, yet the blocks at Giza, at the Osirion, and in the Valley Temple fit together with tolerances so fine that even a razor cannot pass between them. The surfaces are polished, the angles flawless, the joints invisible. There are no gaps to fill with mortar because there is no space to fill. Flinders Petrie, in his 1883 work The Pyramids and Temples of Giza, measured the drill holes in granite cores found near the Great Pyramid. He noted spiral grooves winding down each sample at a uniform pitch grooves that could not have been made by simple hand rotation. The rate of penetration, he wrote, is such that one turn of the drill advanced 1/10 of an inch. This is, in modern engineering, beyond the capacity of hand pressure. Petrie was careful not to claim modern machines, but his astonishment was clear. He described the precision as mechanical, almost mathematical. These cores are still preserved in the Petrie Museum of London. Later engineers compared them with modern machine samples and found the same concentric signature consistent torque, constant pressure. If these grooves were made by a bow drill or sand abrasion, the lines would vary, yet they remain perfectly even. Some researchers have speculated the use of tubular drills tipped with harder materials, perhaps bronze alloys, infused with quartz or corundum. Others suggest vibration or sonic cutting, but the evidence is physical, not explanatory. The granite itself is the record. Inside the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber is constructed from 57 blocks of Aswan granite, each weighing up to 80 tons. The chamber's walls and ceiling beams bear no sign of placement stress. They appear machined and leveled, as if prefabricated and slid into position with precision unseen elsewhere in the ancient world. The red granite sarcophagus inside shows exact symmetry along both axes, with interior corners cut at perfect right angles. When examined with a square and level, it reveals no measurable deviation. Petrie recorded an error margin of less than 1/50th of an inch, comparable to modern optical grinding. The lid, now missing, would have sealed perfectly flush. In 1978, a Japanese team from Waseda University conducted a series of micro-surveys inside the pyramid using ultrasonic and resistivity sensors. They found the granite beams above the king's chamber resonated at specific frequencies when struck around 440 Hz, the same as the musical note A. The acoustic behavior of the chamber suggests it was designed not only for strength, but for sound. The Grand Gallery, leading to it, shares the same proportions, amplifying vibration along its sloping walls. To modern engineers, it resembles a waveguide, a structure that channels and reinforces energy. Whether intentional or coincidental, the design behaves like tuned machinery. The Valley Temple beside the Sphinx shows another layer of complexity. Its walls consist of massive limestone blocks sheathed in granite, each weighing hundreds of tons. The interior surfaces are burnished smooth. In several corners, blocks interlock with complex multi-angled joints, as if fitted by templates rather than by eye. The builders used no mortar, yet the stones still hold their alignment after 4,000 years of earthquakes and floods. When light strikes the inner hall at midday, the granite gleams with a subtle reflection, as though the architecture itself was meant to conduct it. At Abu Sir, the remains of what Egyptologists call the Sun Temples show precision-cut quartzite fragments scattered across the plateau. One slab, now in the Cairo Museum, has perfectly circular holes drilled straight through a meter of quartzite, another stone harder than steel. The holes' interiors bear parallel striations, indistinguishable from those produced by modern core drills. Yet no ancient depiction shows a device capable of such work. To understand these feats, one might look beyond Egypt. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, polygonal stones weighing hundreds of tons interlock with the same seamless precision. In Lebanon, at Baalbek, the trilithon stones of the Temple of Jupiter weigh more than 1,000 tons each, yet are levelled within millimeters. Across these sites, different civilizations separated by oceans achieved similar perfection in stone. None left records of cranes, pulleys, or scaffolding that could explain how. The notion of lost technology often provokes skepticism, yet it may simply mean knowledge misplaced, not alien. The Egyptians measured with cubits derived from the body, divided by proportions that recur in geometry and nature. If their mathematics was empirical, their results were still absolute. Some engineers suggest they used sound and resonance, harnessing vibration to cut or move stone. Experiments in the 1980 seconds by acoustic engineer Tom Danley demonstrated that certain frequencies could cause small objects to levitate. The ancient texts speak of Heka, the science of vibration, translated loosely as magic. In the pyramid texts, the gods are said to raise the stones with their voices. In 2018, researchers from Cairo University found traces of magnetic alignment in the granite beams of the Great Pyramid, weak but measurable. The pattern suggested that the stones were exposed to an electromagnetic field after placement. The discovery was incidental, part of a study on cosmic ray muon detection, but it raised quiet questions among physicists. The pyramid might interact with electromagnetic energy naturally, concentrating it in its lower chambers. Whether this was accidental or intentional remains unknown. On the Giza plateau, the geometry itself feels mechanical. The three pyramids align not just to Orion's belt, but to the curvature of the Earth, as if the builders understood spherical trigonometry. Their base ratios correspond to pi and phi, constants rediscovered thousands of years later. The spacing between the pyramids mirrors harmonic intervals found in music theory. Each monument seems tuned, part of a system rather than a single structure. When the sand covers everything again, only the measurements endure. The pyramids stand not as relics of faith, but as evidence of an engineering logic that defies its assigned century. The copper tools in museum displays tell one story, the granite speaks another. Somewhere between them lies a silence that feels design. The echoes beneath the plateau. Beneath the surface of the Giza plateau, the desert floor hides a second world, a quiet labyrinth cut into the limestone long before history began. To stand on the sands above it is to stand over what may be Egypt's oldest secret, a network of chambers and corridors lying silent beneath the weight of the pyramids. The ancient texts called it the House of Osiris. Modern instruments call it an anomaly. The earliest clue comes from the writings of Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. He described vast subterranean halls under the pyramids where the bodies of kings and the sacred beasts were interred, along with channels of water that flowed from the Nile. Strabo, a Greek geographer writing 4 centuries later, mentioned similar hidden passages under Giza, built for the preservation of records. His words were dismissed as imagination until the late 19th century, when explorers began to find traces of exactly what they described. In 1837, Colonel Howard Vyse drilled into the Great Pyramid, searching for hidden chambers. His gunpowder blasts revealed small voids above the king's chamber, now called the relieving chambers, but no treasure, no body. Yet he also recorded faint echoes when shouting from the Grand Gallery, as though space extended beyond its visible walls. When sound reflects from hollow stone, it leaves a resonance, a hum too low to hear, but strong enough to feel. Visitors still report it today. In 1920, the British explorer Selim Hassan excavated the area around the Sphinx. His team uncovered multiple shafts, leading downward some natural fissures, others clearly cut by hand. One descended 30 feet to a rectangular chamber, flooded by groundwater from the ancient Nile. Inside were blocks shaped like door frames, though no doors remained. Hassan called it a tomb without a body. His report to the Egyptian Antiquities Department noted the possibility of further passages leading west toward the pyramids. The site was resealed after excavation. By the mid-20th century, Egyptian authorities restricted deep digging on the plateau. Official reasons were safety and preservation, but underground mapping continued quietly. In 1978, a joint Egyptian-Czechoslovak team, led by Dr. Arpad Sadek, conducted microgravity surveys across the area between the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. Their results, published briefly in the Bulletin of the Czech Academy of Sciences, identified several low-density anomalies extending beneath the bedrock cavities where solid limestone should exist. The shapes were rectangular, aligned to the cardinal points. No excavation followed. In 1993, engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink used a small robotic rover named Upuat to explore the narrow shafts rising from the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. One of the shafts ended at a limestone door, fitted with copper handles impossible for a mere ventilation duct. A decade later, NASA engineers assisted in drilling a small hole through it. Behind the stone lay another chamber, its floor covered in fine dust. Beyond that, a second sealed door. The purpose of these miniature corridors remains unknown, yet they suggest a network extending deep within the structure, perhaps connected to a larger subterranean design. Further evidence came in 1999 when the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities authorized limited ground-penetrating radar studies around the Sphinx. Conducted by Thomas Debicki and John Anthony West, the scans revealed distinct linear voids beneath the monument's left paw and a large rectangular cavity approximately 9 meters below the surface between the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. Debicki described the reflections as consistent with man-made chambers of considerable size. The announcement drew worldwide attention. The results were later classified as inconclusive, and permissions for follow-up drilling were withdrawn. Whispers of a Hall of Records have persisted since then, but even without legend, the geology confirms a hidden topography. The plateau rests on a layered limestone bed known as the Mokattam Formation, riddled with natural fissures and caves. Some may have been enlarged and reinforced in antiquity. When workers from the Egyptian Antiquities Organization were repairing a sewer line near the Great Pyramid in 1987, they broke into an unknown chamber filled with stagnant water and pottery shards. The opening was resealed after brief documentation. The air around Giza holds a faint hum after sunset, a vibration that early explorers mistook for wind. Acoustic surveys by the University of Cairo in 2010 mapped sound propagation through the bedrock and detected anomalies regions that absorbed or echoed sound differently than the surrounding stone. These pockets corresponded closely with earlier radar findings. Engineers proposed they might be air-filled cavities or ancient drainage channels. Some of these anomalies lie directly beneath the causeway connecting the Sphinx Temple and the Pyramid of Khafre, suggesting an intentional alignment. Under the Pyramid of Khafre itself, a natural cavern opens into a hewn chamber accessible by a steep descending passage. At its lowest level lies a basalt floor and a sarcophagus carved into the rock. The chamber's symmetry and polished contrast with the rough quarry marks above it, implying that the lower portion is older than the pyramid resting on top. This layering of structures old beneath new repeats across the plateau. Egyptian workers clearing sand south of the Sphinx in 2017 reported a hollow sound under their shovels. Subsurface imaging confirmed a corridor running east-west at a depth of 12 meters, ending beneath the ancient tomb of Osiris in the so-called Tomb of the Birds. The name recalls an older myth. Osiris, god of the underworld, was said to lie beneath the house of stone where the river once flowed. The Osiris shaft, discovered in 1933 by Selim Hassan and reopened in the 1990 seconds, fits that description. It descends through 3 levels, the lowest filled with water. At its base lies a stone sarcophagus surrounded by niches as if awaiting occupants. Its age is uncertain, but its style differs completely from dynastic tombs, more geometric, less decorative, as though built for function rather than ritual. If these tunnels once connected the pyramids, the purpose remains elusive. Some suggest they formed a hydraulic system to regulate groundwater and reduce pressure under the monuments. Others view them as symbolic passages mirroring the star's journey through the underworld. A smaller group believes they are remnants of an older technological complex, an ancient laboratory of measurement, energy, or preservation. The evidence is mute, resting beneath meters of stone and sand. In 2021, Japanese muon tomography teams scanning the Great Pyramid, detected yet another hidden void 30 meters long above the Grand Gallery. It has no known entrance. Its shape resembles a corridor or chamber, untouched since construction. The discovery confirmed what early explorers suspected. The pyramid is not solid, but honeycombed with hidden geometry. Each scan reveals new cavities, like breaths trapped in stone. When the desert wind rises, fine sand sweeps across the plateau and settles again, layer upon layer. Beneath it, the echoes remain, sealed doors, silent air. Empty chambers that wait without sound or witness. Egypt's surface tells one story, the monuments we see. Below, another continues dark, precise, and unfinished. The silent gods of stone. Across Egypt, colossal figures rise from the dust, with faces too calm for the centuries they have endured. Some sit broken, others stand without eyes, their gaze erased by time. These statues, guardians, kings, and deities, do not shout their identity. They remain still and anonymous, carved with a precision that sometimes predates the dynasties inscribed on their bases. Their silence is the oldest language Egypt ever spoke. At Luxor, the seated colossi of Amenhotep III, known as the Colossi of Memnon, have watched the Nile flood and recede for more than 3,000 years. Yet geological studies show that the quartzite used for these figures came from quarries near Cairo, over 400 miles to the north. Each block weighed more than 700 tons. The logistics of moving them down the river remain unexplained. Some believe they were carved on site, but traces of weathering on the lower surfaces suggest they stood exposed long before their attributed reign. Ancient visitors in Roman times reported one of the statues singing at dawn, a phenomenon caused by trapped air and dew expanding within cracked stone. To them, it was a god's breath returning each morning. Further south, at Abu Simbel, two seated figures of Ramses II face east, aligned so that sunlight touches the inner sanctuary twice a year on February 22 and October 22. These alignments correspond roughly to the spring and autumn of the agricultural calendar, but there is no record explaining how the builders achieved such accuracy without modern instruments. Beneath their grandeur lies an older puzzle. The interior chambers of the temple are carved into the mountain itself in a style that differs from known New Kingdom techniques. Its earliest layers bear the signs of recut stone, as if adapted from a pre-existing monument. On the Giza plateau, the Sphinx stands apart from any known artistic school. Its face, smaller than proportion suggests, may have been recarved during the Old Kingdom. Early sketches from Napoleon's survey in 1798 show erosion deeper on the body than the head, supporting this idea. If the head was altered, the original form, perhaps leonine, or something now unrecognizable, belongs to another age. To the Egyptians, it represented Horimakhet, the god of the horizon. To geologists, it represents a record of weather older than the desert. When one travels to Abydos, the Osirion lies hidden behind the temple of Seti I. Its megalithic pillars, carved from rose granite and arranged in symmetrical rectangles, stand in stark contrast to the refined reliefs of Seti's era. The Osirion's style resembles no other structure from the New Kingdom. Instead, it mirrors the massive simplicity of the valley temple near the Sphinx. Many scholars suspect it was discovered, not built, by Seti, who added inscriptions to honor Osiris. The temple above, bright with art, is a monument to belief. The one below, silent and geometric, is a monument to knowledge. Throughout Egypt, fragments of statues appear in places they should not. In Tanis, a city built from repurposed ruins, archaeologists found blocks bearing cartouches of pharaohs from entirely different centuries, Ramesses II, Merneptah, and Schoch, all mixed together. The base layers of these structures show erosion inconsistent with their supposed date. Beneath Tanis, seismic scans have revealed stone foundations older than any of its recorded dynasties. The pattern repeats at Saqqara, where the step pyramid of Djoser rises above a labyrinth of corridors that appear older than the pyramid itself. The statues of gods also raise questions of lineage. The earliest known depictions of Osiris, Isis, and Horus appear fully formed, with symbolic crowns and regalia. There is no transitional art showing the evolution of their imagery. In later dynasties, sculptors imitated the same proportions, as if copying from a canon already ancient. The eyes are elongated, the limbs slim, the pose eternally frontal. But in the oldest statues like the pre-dynastic Shabaka stone or the enigmatic Farfrae, enthroned the symmetry reaches a mathematical balance rarely repeated. The face of Khafre, carved in diorite harder than steel, is polished to a mirror finish and aligned perfectly along the vertical axis. Engineers who studied it in 1982 found the two sides of the face differ by less than a millimeter. Such precision cannot be accidental. In 1904, the Egyptologist George Reisner discovered fragments of a colossal statue at Giza, carved from a single block of basalt, now fragmented beyond recognition. The material, so hard that it must be shaped with diamond or corundum tools today, had been smoothed and engraved with perfect curves. Reisner noted that the style does not belong to the known dynasties. The fragment bore no inscription, no cartouche, only the outline of what may have been an unfamiliar headdress, one not seen in any other Egyptian art. The statue was reburied after examination to prevent further damage. The Cairo Museum holds another mystery: a black diorite statue of a seated figure found near the Temple of Khafre. The workmanship is so advanced that its surfaces reflect light like glass. The base, however, shows signs of later carving hieroglyphs inscribed less deeply, as if added after the fact. The contrast between the ancient polish and the later marks suggests two different epochs of craftsmanship. The later Egyptians may have inscribed their own names onto relics they could not reproduce. Even smaller artifacts hint at older origins. The Baghdad batteries, though found in Iraq, demonstrate that ancient artisans in the Near East understood electrochemical reactions thousands of years before their rediscovery. In Egypt, gilding techniques and glass-like glazes appear suddenly in the archaeological record, already perfected. Some of these chemical methods would not be replicated until the modern era. The statues of the gods often share one hidden feature. They are anatomically impossible. Limbs too elongated, heads too large, eyes too symmetrical for human proportion. The god Ptah is depicted with a skull shape inconsistent with any known people of the Nile Valley. The goddess Sekhmet's lioness form is carved with precision matching feline anatomy, but scaled to human stature. Scholars interpret these as symbolic. Others wonder if they preserve the likeness of beings once believed to be real. In later temples, artists began to exaggerate features: broad shoulders, narrow waists, stylized poses, but the oldest works show restraint, balance, and geometry closer to technical drawing than art. The sculptors measured not beauty, but proportion. Some researchers, such as architect G. Dormion, believe these ratios were based on harmonic divisions of the circle, the same ratios found in the layout of the Great Pyramid. It suggests a single mathematical language underlying both architecture and sculpture. When the sun sets across Egypt's ruins, the statues fade into shadow, their details dissolving until only silhouettes remain. The gods they represent no longer have names that we can speak, yet their presence endures through shape and stone faces, so still they seem to listen. The modern visitor sees weathered stone. The ancient priest saw eternity. Both, perhaps, are correct. The flood that erased the builders. In the layers of sediment that cradle the Nile Valley, there is a faint compressed band of dark silt mixed with ash and gravel. It marks a pause in human time, a moment when the land drowned and everything built upon it disappeared. This layer does not belong to any dynasty. It belongs to an event the Egyptians would later remember only in myth, the flood that ended the first time. Around 12,800 years ago, at the close of the Pleistocene epoch, Earth entered a sudden and violent shift known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures dropped, glaciers advanced, and then just as abruptly meltwater poured across continents. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters. The great rivers changed their paths. The Sahara transformed from savanna to desert. In this chaos, entire coastlines vanished beneath new seas. Any civilization that had flourished along them would have been erased almost overnight. Scientists studying ice cores from Greenland found traces of platinum in layers corresponding to this period, suggesting a cosmic impact, perhaps a comet fragment striking the ice sheet. The explosion would have triggered fires, floods, and decades of cooling. Around the same time, in the Near East, the first known permanent settlements, Gobekli Tepe, Jericho, Tel Caramel, appeared suddenly, as if survivors were rebuilding rather than inventing civilization. Their architecture was already sophisticated, their alignment astronomical, their purpose ceremonial. If an older culture existed before Egypt, it would have lived through this transition. The Egyptian creation myth begins not with fire, but with water none, the endless flood. Out of it rose the primeval mound, the first land. On this mound stood Atum, who brought forth the gods and men. The imagery fits perfectly with a memory of flood and rebirth. The priests of Heliopolis believed that Giza was the physical location of that first rising Zep Tepe, the first time. The pyramids, in their design, may not commemorate kings at all, but the restoration of order after the waters withdrew. Modern geology supports the story hidden in myth. The Nile's course has shifted repeatedly over the past 20,000 years. Sediment cores taken near Giza show evidence of freshwater marshland between 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, long before the Old Kingdom. Fossil pollen from papyrus and acacia trees indicate a wetter climate, followed by rapid aridification. The ancient lakebed discovered under the Fayum Depression once stretched toward the plateau. The Sphinx, if carved during that wetter age, would have stood beside a body of water, not a desert. In 2007, sonar surveys along Egypt's Mediterranean coast revealed submerged ruins off the city of Alexandria, columns, statues, and walls, now lying beneath several meters of silt. They are remnants of later dynasties, but their preservation shows how quickly rising water can erase a world. Farther west, near the Gulf of Sidra, satellite images revealed circular formations beneath shallow seas, possible harbour rings and breakwaters, weathered and buried under sand. Some researchers believe they mark settlements predating dynastic Egypt, flooded during the post-glacial sea rise. The story of a great deluge is not unique to Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a flood sent by the gods to cleanse the earth. The Sumerian king list divides its rulers into those before and after the flood. In Greece, the myth of Deucalion tells of the same. Across the world, in India, in China, among the Maya, the same event reappears under different names. Cultures separated by oceans recall a single turning of the world. Plato, writing in 360 BCE, recounted the Egyptian priest's story of Atlantis, a civilization destroyed by flood around 9,600 BCE, the exact boundary of the Younger Dryas. He described it as lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles, perhaps in the Atlantic. To the priests, it was already ancient. To Plato, it was a warning. To modern geology, the date aligns with abrupt meltwater pulses recorded in oceanic cores. The coincidence is striking. If the builders of the earliest monuments lived before this catastrophe, their cities may lie underwater. Along the Red Sea coast, Marine archaeologists from Alexandria University have documented submerged foundations 20 meters below the surface, covered with coral. In the Gulf of Aqaba, sonar scans in 2015 detected symmetrical stone walls arranged in grids beneath the sand. No excavation has been permitted, but the formations appear artificial. The sudden disappearance of green landscapes across North Africa after 7000 BCE also suggests more than simple drought. Rock art in the Gilf Kabir Plateau shows herds of cattle, hunters, and rivers scenes of life, where now only stone remains. The people who drew them vanished with the climate shift, leaving only pigment and silence. Those who migrated east toward the Nile brought with them symbols that would later define Egyptian culture: the ankh, the sunboat, the falcon. It is as if they were rebuilding memory from fragments of an older order. In 2010, a team from the University of Bern used satellite topography to model the spread of fresh water after the last glacial melt. Their simulation showed that the Nile Delta expanded by nearly 100 kilometers during the early Holocene, then rapidly contracted as sediment accumulated. Entire floodplains could have disappeared, taking settlements with them. In this lost geography, the roots of Egyptian civilization might still sleep beneath mud and salt. Some inscriptions hint that the ancient priests remembered. The coffin texts, written more than 2,000 years after the supposed flood, speak of a time when the heavens wept and the waters covered the mountains. They describe the survivors, the followers of Horus, emerging on high ground, guided by the stars. They built again, measuring the earth as before. The text does not name the flood, only calls it the great inundation that erased the memory of men. To later generations, the flood became renewal. The annual rising of the Nile was its echo, a small repetition of the world's cleansing. The pyramids, temples, and canals were built as instruments of balance, keeping chaos at bay. But beneath their calm geometry lies the story of a world that drowned. Every civilization carries a silence between its origins and its history. For Egypt, that silence may have been water. Beneath the deserts, beneath the silt, the forgotten city of the builders might still rest, its stones clean, its corridors filled not with air, but with the slow movement of an ancient sea. The star map of the gods. When night descends upon the Giza plateau, the pyramids become silhouettes against a field of stars. Their points align with a precision that seems deliberate, mathematical, older than the desert itself. To look down from the sky is to see a reflection, Orion mirrored on earth. The Egyptians called that constellation Sa, the celestial form of Osiris, lord of the afterlife. His rising and setting marked the cycle of death and rebirth, the rhythm of the Nile, and the geometry of the pyramids themselves. In 1993, Robert Bauval, a Belgian engineer, observed that the three pyramids of Giza are arranged to match the stars of Orion's belt. The offset of the smallest pyramid, that of Menkaure, mirrors the faintest star, Mintaka, which lies slightly off the alignment of the other two. When calculated for the position of Orion around 10,500 BCE, the correspondence becomes exact. That same epoch is when the constellation rose directly south of Giza at dawn during the spring equinox, and when the Sphinx facing east would have stared at the rising of Leo. The sky and the stone formed one message, a record of the heavens frozen in rock. Egyptian religion was built on this principle: as above, so below. The pharaoh was a bridge between the two worlds, his tomb a vehicle to ascend among the stars. In the pyramid texts of Unas, written around 2350 BCE, the king is told, "You are the star that crosses the sky. You join the imperishable stars that know no destruction." The imperishable stars referred to the circumpolar constellations, those that never set. But the journey began at Orion, the gate of Osiris, and ended among the northern lights of eternity. The shafts within the Great Pyramid seem designed to trace this path. The southern shaft of the king's chamber, aligns with Orion's belt, the northern with the circumpolar stars of Ursa Minor. In the Queen's Chamber, the southern shaft points to Sirius, the star of Isis, while the northern again faces toward the pole. The design creates a cosmic map in stone, Osiris and Isis below, the eternal stars above. To the builders, the pyramid was not just a tomb, but a resurrection engine, a fixed horizon where the soul could travel from earth to heaven along the geometry of light. The ancient Egyptians recorded time by the movement of these same stars. Long before the invention of the solar calendar, they used a system based on the heliacal rising of Sirius, whose reappearance each year heralded the Nile flood. This event came with perfect regularity, renewing both land and sky. Even today, Sirius remains visible at dawn over the eastern horizon near midsummer, just as it did 5,000 years ago. For the priests of Heliopolis, it was the pulse of the cosmos. The temple at Dendera preserves a carved star map, known as the Dendera zodiac, showing constellations recognizable to modern astronomy: Orion, Taurus, Libra, and even the precession of the equinoxes. Its circular layout suggests a deep understanding of celestial cycles, especially the slow wobble of Earth's axis, which completes a full rotation every 25,920 years. The concept of such precession was officially discovered by Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE, yet Dendera's ceiling implies the Egyptians already tracked it. Each symbol represents a moment in the great celestial year. In this system, the age of Leo, roughly 10,500 BCE, marks the last time the Sphinx would have faced its mirror in the sky. The builders' obsession with orientation extended across Egypt. The Temple of Karnak aligns to the midsummer sunrise. The Temple of Abu Simbel was constructed so that sunlight penetrates its inner chamber only twice each year, illuminating statues of the gods. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera aligns with Sirius, its inner sanctum acting as a lens for the first light of the star's return. Across millennia, architecture functioned as calendar, compass, and observatory. In 2017, satellite imagery analysis by the University of Western Ontario compared over 50 ancient temple sites along the Nile. Nearly all were aligned to significant solar or stellar events, solstices, equinoxes, and specific star risings. The data revealed a gradual shift in orientation over centuries, corresponding to the slow drift of precession. This continuity suggests that generations of builders recalibrated their temples to follow the stars, preserving the same cosmic order through time. For the ancient priests, the universe was not empty space, but living hierarchy. The stars were gods, the planets their messengers. Orion was Osiris, Sirius was Isis, the Milky Way was the celestial Nile. When they built on Earth, they replicated heaven's structure. To misalign a temple was to disturb balance itself, Ma'at, the order that sustained all things. The architect's duty was therefore sacred, a ritual act as vital as prayer. Some researchers believe this celestial mapping extends beyond Egypt. If one overlays the positions of major pyramid complexes along the Nile, Giza, Abu Sir, Saqqara, they trace a descending spiral pattern that mirrors the curve of Orion's belt and sword. The correlation is not perfect, but the geometry is suggestive, as if each generation built a link in a chain descending from the stars. At the island of Elephantine, inscriptions record that the priests of Khnum measured the flood by the star. Their instruments, simple sighting rods and cords, were used to align structures with uncanny accuracy. Yet the knowledge encoded in the monuments seems greater than what these tools could measure. The pyramid's alignment to true north deviates by less than 4 arc minutes, an accuracy surpassing most modern constructions. To achieve this, the builders must have observed the sky over long intervals, watching the slow drift of celestial poles. Astronomers have simulated the sky over Giza using planetarium software. Around 10,500 BCE, the constellation Orion reached its lowest position on the horizon. After that, it began to rise higher, each millennium, a cycle spanning thousands of years. The builders of Giza could have encoded this moment of rebirth, the point when the god Osiris Orion was at his nadir, awaiting resurrection. The pyramids, rising from the desert like a triad of stars, may mark not a burial ground, but a timestamp in cosmic history. The temple inscriptions often speak of the sky opening and the gods descending as light. "The doors of heaven are opened for you," reads one passage. "You travel on the rays of the sun." To the modern mind, these are metaphors. To the ancient architect, they were coordinates. When viewed from space, the entire Giza complex forms a pattern that aligns with both cardinal and stellar directions. The causeways point toward the solstitial sun, the pyramids to Orion, and the Sphinx to Leo. It is both map and message, a frozen diagram of the heavens as they once were, written in stone across the earth. The stars have shifted since then. Orion no longer rises where it did. The Sphinx's gaze meets only empty air. But the map remains. It waits, unaltered, a quiet record of the sky before history began, a memory of the gods written not in words, but in alignment. The hidden science of the temples, along the Nile, where the air still carries the hum of cicadas and the faint scent of sandstone dust. The ancient temples lie not as ruins, but as instruments. Their design, orientation, and materials form a kind of equation, a geometry of sound, light, and resonance that seems to obey laws far older than religion. The ancient Egyptians called these sanctuaries Per-Netja, house of the god, yet within their walls one finds not only symbols of worship, but traces of precise engineering acoustic chambers, magnetic alignments, and geometries that appear to control energy. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is a quiet example. Its ceilings are covered in astronomical reliefs, the zodiac, constellations, and the star Sirius. In its crypts, narrow, hidden passages carved deep into the stone, researchers discovered strange bas-reliefs known as the Dendera light. The carvings depict elongated bulbs connected by thick cords to a lotus-shaped base. Egyptologists interpret them as mythic scenes of creation, the emergence of the serpent of light. Engineers, however, noticed that the shapes resemble high-voltage discharge tubes, similar to Crookes tubes used in early electrical experiments. The lotus base mirrors the form of a jade pillar, a symbol of stability but also of energy rising through the body. Though such interpretations remain controversial, the physical structure of the temple supports the idea of an acoustic device. When sound is made in the central sanctuary, its resonance carries through the surrounding corridors in harmonic waves. In 2005, acoustic engineers from the University of Leuven measured sustained frequencies inside Dendera between 110 and 440 Hz, the same tones used in musical tuning. The echo duration was longer than any natural room of similar size. The builders had shaped the interior to sustain vibration, as though the temple itself were meant to hum. This pattern repeats across Egypt. At the Temple of Karnak, the hypostyle hall contains 134 stone columns rising over 20 meters high. When wind passes through their narrow spaces, the sound deepens into a low harmonic drone. Ancient priests described these tones as the voices of the gods. Modern physicists would call it resonance. The entire complex aligns with the midsummer sunrise. Each year, the first light strikes a single axis, illuminating the sanctuary of Amun-Ra. The moment was not symbolic, it was calibration. Magnetometers used during surveys in the 1,980 seconds detected slight anomalies along Karnak's central axis, fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field amplified by the quartz-rich sandstone. Quartz has piezoelectric properties. It generates electrical charge under pressure or vibration. In a temple built to resonate, the effect could be measurable. The same stone choice appears at Luxor, Edfu, and Philae. The priests who designed these spaces may not have known the term piezoelectric, yet they understood the behavior of living stone. At Abydos, the Osirion half-submerged and perpetually cool reveals an even more refined geometry. The rectangular pit is lined with rose granite blocks whose dimensions follow the golden ratio, phi. Water seeps through cracks from the nearby water table, filling the chamber to knee height. When measured with hydrophones, the sound of chanting within the hall forms standing waves that ripple across the surface, visible in the reflections of torchlight. In ancient ritual, this room was used for rebirth ceremonies. The acoustic patterns create a literal vibration of renewal. Temples were constructed according to what the Egyptians called seshat, the act of stretching the cord. Before any foundation was laid, the high priest and the pharaoh stood at night holding a taut rope aligned to a specific star, often Sirius or Polaris. This ritual, recorded on temple walls from Edfu to Dendera, ensured celestial accuracy. The stars determined direction, sound determined proportion. The act combined astronomy, geometry, and liturgy into one operation. Hieroglyphic texts on the walls of Edfu describe the builders as the followers of Horus, who measured with the heart. To measure with the heart meant to find harmony, mathematical order, expressed as feeling. The priests saw no boundary between science and spirit. Their knowledge of frequency, proportion, and orientation was sacred. In 2018, laser scanning of the Luxor temple revealed subtle distortions in column spacing that corrected for optical illusion, an ancient form of perspective control. The columns widened slightly toward the edges of the hall, creating the visual impression of perfect symmetry when seen from the entrance. The adjustment is so slight, less than 1 degree, but deliberate. The builders anticipated human perception centuries before Euclid wrote his geometry. Some scholars suggest that these temples acted as repositories of scientific principles in symbolic form. The myth of the god Thoth, inventor of writing and measure, mirrors the process of experimentation. The story of Osiris's dismemberment and restoration parallels the cycle of disassembly and reconstruction, deconstruction of matter, reformation of life. The priests spoke in myth, but worked in measurement. Even the colors within temples were chosen with care. Pigments of blue and gold were mixed with copper and iron oxides, creating surfaces that reflected light differently under torch flame and sunlight. When the rising sun entered the sanctuary, the reflected spectrum would flicker, changing hue as if the walls themselves were alive. This use of reflective pigment was not decorative, it was interactive. Light was an element of worship and calculation. In the temple of Komombo, dedicated jointly to Sobek and Horus, hieroglyphs depict surgical tools, scalpels, forceps, and vessels, suggesting an understanding of anatomy. Nearby chambers show symmetrical design ideal for airflow and preservation. The rooms remain cooler than the surrounding desert even today without modern ventilation. The layout itself functions as environmental engineering. Some modern physicists, like Dr. Paul Laviolette, have speculated that Egypt's temples encoded harmonic ratios consistent with wave physics, the same patterns found in sound, light, and orbital mechanics. While speculative, the numbers align: 432, 864, 1,728 ratios, found both in ancient measurements and in astronomical scales. Whether coincidence or continuity, the repetition of these ratios suggests knowledge transmitted through architecture rather than text. In Egypt's deserts, where paper decays and stone endures, information survives only in dimension. The temples are not merely places, they are data carved into silence. To walk their corridors is to move through equations translated into weight and shadow. The priests may have called it worship. Today, we might call it science in another language. When sound fades in these chambers, a stillness follows that feels almost electrical. The air holds the memory of vibration, the stone retains its charge. The temple sleeps, but the design continues to function, resonating faintly with wind, light, and the patient rhythm of the earth itself. The legacy of the lost engineers. When archaeologists first began excavating the ruins of Egypt in the 19th century, they were struck by an odd pattern. The oldest structures were the most precise. The farther back one looked, the greater the craftsmanship appeared. In most civilizations, skills advance with time. In Egypt, it seemed the opposite. The first monuments, massive, flawless, and enduring, were followed by centuries of imitation, as though later generations were maintaining a legacy they could no longer reproduce. The earliest dynasties inherited cities already ancient. The builders of the Old Kingdom, ruling around 2600 BCE, raised the Great Pyramids and the temples of Giza, but they left no detailed plans, no transitional prototypes. The engineering simply appeared fully formed, as if imported. When later pharaohs attempted to emulate these works, their pyramids crumbled. The Pyramid of Meidum collapsed during construction. The bent pyramid at Dashur, built under Sneferu, changed angle halfway up, its architects uncertain how to support its weight. The Red Pyramid, though successful, lacks the perfection of Giza. After that, Egypt never built another true pyramid of stone. By the Middle Kingdom, kings had turned to mud brick, cheaper, faster, temporary. The precision of the past had become myth. Priests preserved the measurements, reciting rituals of alignment and proportion, but the tools themselves had changed. The stonemasons of Thebes or Karnak could carve reliefs of extraordinary beauty, yet they no longer achieved the seamless interlocking blocks of earlier ages. When asked why, ancient texts simply say, "It was known to our fathers." Flinders Petrie, who spent decades surveying Egypt in the late 1800s, wrote that the early dynasties show mechanical precision equal to the best modern engineering, while later ages show careless work and weak construction. He recorded cuts in granite that seemed impossible to reproduce with the copper chisels found nearby. At Saqqara, he noted drill holes showing uniform spirals, the signature of mechanical rotation. By contrast, New Kingdom quarries reveal rougher techniques, the marks of hand tools. The knowledge had not evolved, it had declined. The temples of Abydos tell the same story. The Osirion, buried beneath Seti, this grand temple, is built from granite blocks fitted with invisible seams. The temple above it, carved centuries later, is ornate but structurally simple. It uses smaller stones, plastered joints, and uneven symmetry. The contrast is physical, not interpretive. The lower builders understood weight, resonance, and water pressure. The upper ones understood paint and inscription. The difference between them is the difference between an engineer and a scribe. Some archaeologists propose a simple explanation. Resources changed. The centralized power that funded megalithic projects faded after the Old Kingdom's collapse. Without vast labor forces or access to quarries, later dynasties built smaller and faster. Yet this does not explain the loss of method. Even with fewer workers, the technique of leveling a foundation, aligning to true north, or cutting basalt to optical smoothness should have remained. Instead, these skills vanish from the record as suddenly as they appeared. At Karnak, one finds stones from earlier temples reused in newer walls, their hieroglyphs inverted or cut through. These are talatat blocks, repurposed from demolished sanctuaries. The builders treated them as raw material, not as artifacts of superior engineering. It is as if they no longer recognize the science embedded in the stones. Similar patterns appear in other cultures, Inca masons building atop megaliths at Cusco, Roman architects constructing amphitheaters over cyclopean walls. Each generation inherits a mystery, builds around it, and calls it its own. In 1984, A survey by the Egyptian Geological Society compared tool marks across 3 millennia of monuments. The findings were clear. Earlier cuts showed linear patterns of abrasion, consistent with saws or mechanical oscillation. Later cuts were irregular, showing chisel impact and wedging. The difference was not style, it was technique. The lost engineers had mastered precision at a scale that later craftsmen never regained. Ancient Egyptians themselves hinted at this inheritance. In the Edfu texts, they wrote of the temple of the first time, built by the divine ones, restored by the children of the sun. The phrase restored appears repeatedly. The builders did not claim invention, they claimed preservation. The priests described themselves as caretakers of ancient plans, copying what had already existed. The architect Imhotep, who designed the step pyramid of Djoser, was remembered as a healer and magician, a man who found the secret writings of the ancestors. When Napoleon's savants measured the Great Pyramid in 1799, they noticed a mathematical precision that echoed natural constants. The ratio of its height to perimeter reflected the relationship between radius and circumference, 2 pi. The base was aligned to true north with an error of less than 1/50th of a degree. These numbers are not arbitrary. They suggest a level of observation and calculation difficult to achieve without modern instruments. Later, pyramids abandoned these proportions entirely. The formula was known once, then forgotten. During restoration work in 2015, archaeologists discovered stone blocks at the base of the Great Pyramid, showing traces of an unusual substance, a fine crystalline coating, almost like fused quartz. When analyzed, it contained traces of silicon and sodium compounds, perhaps remnants of a vitrification process. The outer casing stones, once polished white, reflected sunlight so strongly that ancient texts described the pyramid as shining, like the sun itself. No other Egyptian monument was ever treated this way. The technology of that glaze, whether chemical or mechanical, disappeared with the builders. Even written language hints at decline. The earliest hieroglyphs, carved into ivory tags and stone palettes from Abydos around 3200 BCE, appear complete, with grammar and structure already formed. There is no progression from primitive pictographs to full writing. Egyptian civilization begins in perfection, then simplifies over time hieratic script, demotic shorthand, the erosion of form mirroring the erosion of technique. By the late dynasties, pharaohs looked backward, restoring temples, recopying texts, reviving styles from the Old Kingdom. They spoke of returning to the ways of the ancestors, but they could not rebuild what the ancestors had built. Inscriptions at Karnak record repairs made to foundations laid in the time of the gods. The engineers of those foundations were gone, their tools and measures turned into ceremony. To the modern visitor, the difference between dynasties appears as layers of stone, older blocks beneath newer carvings, precision beneath decoration. The silent engineers of the earliest age left behind a system that endured even after its purpose was forgotten. The later Egyptians lived within its shadow, preserving its geometry through faith when understanding had faded. Across the centuries, the monuments continued to serve. The pyramids became tombs. The temples became altars. The measures became rituals. The knowledge that once turned stone into mechanism became myth. But beneath every later layer, the older engineering remains immovable, exact, and strangely impersonal, as if the hands that built it were guided by something more constant than time. The legacy of the lost engineers is not a single artifact. It is the foundation of an entire civilization. Egypt rose upon their work, inherited their structures, and carried their memory in stone long after their names were erased. What remains is the perfection of the first builders, the quiet proof that mastery came before history began, the memory keepers of the Nile. In every ancient city along the Nile, there stood a small, secluded building near the great temples. It was called the Per Ankh, the House of Life. To ordinary Egyptians, it was a place of writing and prayer. To the priests within, it was a vault of preservation, where knowledge too old to understand was copied again and again, each generation renewing what it could not explain. These men were not inventors, they were custodians. Inside the House of Life, rows of papyrus scrolls rested in wooden chests, organized by subject, astronomy, medicine, architecture, mathematics, hymns. The scribes who tended them traced their lineage to Thoth, the god of wisdom, said to have recorded the laws of heaven in 42 sacred books. The Greek historian Clement of Alexandria claimed to have seen them, writing in the 2nd century CE, that the priests read from the books of Thoth, containing hymns to the gods, rules for kings, and the knowledge of the stars. No copies survive, but fragments of their language remain scattered through the later temples, half symbol, half memory. At Edfu, priests carved the story of the followers of Horus, the builders who came from the island of the egg before the flood. They described rebuilding the temple according to ancient blueprints preserved in the House of Life. The texts refer to a divine book of foundation that was old when the world was young. When archaeologists first translated these inscriptions in the early 20th century, they dismissed them as mythology, but their precision in describing measurement, alignment, and celestial observation suggests more than story, it suggests memory filtered through ritual. The temple priests functioned as astronomers and engineers. They tracked the rising of Sirius to predict the Nile's flood, charted the movement of planets, and adjusted calendars with mathematical care. Yet by the New Kingdom, much of this science had become sacred theatre. Alignments were maintained, formulas repeated, but the reason for them had been replaced by devotion. What had begun as a method became a rite. The stretching of the cord ceremony performed before every major construction survived unchanged for thousands of years. The pharaoh and high priest, standing side by side under the stars, used a knotted rope to mark the temple's orientation. They aligned it to the rising of a chosen star, often Sirius or Polaris. The ritual was believed to please the gods, but its practical purpose was lost. The priests had become astronomers without astronomy, repeating procedures inherited from a forgotten geometry. Even within their sacred texts, fragments of old measurement persisted. The number 432 appears often the length of a sacred cycle, the count of divine years, the measure of the heart of Ra. Modern researchers have noted that 432 and its multiples correspond to astronomical ratios: Earth's rotation, the precession of equinoxes, the lunar month. To the priests, these numbers were holy, their meanings buried beneath repetition. The science survived only as incantation. In the Temple of Kom Ombo, inscriptions list anatomical drawings and surgical tools, yet the accompanying texts read like spells. A priest might recite, "The breath of life enters the nostrils, the heart knows its measure." What had once been medical observation became metaphor, knowledge fossilized into language, preserved not through understanding, but through reverence. The priests of Heliopolis held another kind of memory, the cosmic. Each dawn, they faced the horizon to greet the sun with hymns that had been sung since before the pyramids. In one surviving papyrus, the priest writes, "We watch for the coming of Ra as our fathers did, to know when he will cross the stars." The phrase "to know when he will cross the stars" suggests they once tracked the sun's apparent movement against constellations, a primitive solar year calculation. But in later centuries, the act became purely devotional, the observation unnecessary. The practice endured, the knowledge behind it faded. The scribes knew they were copying fragments. Some complained of it openly. In a 19th dynasty manuscript known as the Instruction of Keti, a teacher warns his pupil, "Write what is before you, not what is forgotten, for the old words are beyond men." It is a rare confession of decline, the awareness that the text itself outlived comprehension. Greek scholars who later visited Egypt encountered these custodians and mistook their silence for secrecy. Plato wrote of priests in Sais who knew the cycles of heaven when our ancestors were still herding cattle. Herodotus described them as guardians of vast historical records carved on temple walls, dating back tens of thousands of years. Whether these records were literal or symbolic, the impression remained. Egypt possessed time. It remembered longer than anyone else. When Alexander's armies entered Egypt in 332 BCE, the old temples still functioned as observatories. The priests continued to measure shadows and stars, though the meanings had grown theological. Greek scholars absorbed their methods and translated them into their own science: geometry, astronomy, medicine. What the Egyptians preserved through ritual, the Greeks revived through reason. Civilization's chain of memory tightened again, each link unaware of its origin. In the Ptolemaic era, the last high priests of Heliopolis and Thebes continued to maintain the houses of life. They copied the old scrolls onto papyrus that would soon decay, knowing their empire was ending. Some of these texts may have traveled to the Library of Alexandria, where they burned with the city's archives. Others were sealed in tombs, buried with the scribes who feared forgetting more than death. By the time Rome ruled the Nile, the priesthood's language had already changed. The hieroglyphs became hieratic, then demotic, finally replaced by Greek and Coptic. The old temples fell silent. Yet the tradition of preservation, the instinct to record, to measure, to keep endured. From the papyri of Thebes to the manuscripts of Alexandria, from the monks of early Christianity to the scholars of the Renaissance, the chain never broke entirely. Every empire that followed Egypt inherited its fragments, its geometry, its star maps, its calendars. Even the meter, the modern measure of distance, approximates 1/10,000,000th of the Earth's meridian, a concept first recorded, in different form, on Egyptian cubit rods. The precision of the past reappears disguised as progress. When the desert wind moves through the ruins of Thebes or Karnak today, it carries a low hum through the columns, a tone between note and whisper. The ancient priests might have called it the voice of Thoth. To us, it is the sound of memory itself, still resonating in the stone they guarded. The knowledge they once protected has scattered, but its rhythm remains. Egypt's greatest secret may not have been what it knew, but how fiercely it refused to forget. The shadow beneath time. Across the centuries, the Nile has carried more than water. It has carried memory slow, sedimented, unbroken. Every flood buried one layer of history and revealed another, turning the land itself into a quiet archive. From the quarries of Aswan to the sands of Giza, from the drowned coastlines to the forgotten vaults beneath the temples, Egypt has remained a question disguised as a civilization. It is not what it built that astonishes, it is what it remembered and what it chose not to explain. The oldest stones tell no stories. They simply exist, untouched by language, bearing angles and alignments that obey laws too constant to be accident. The later inscriptions try to interpret them, calling them the work of kings, of gods, of ancestors who came before the flood. But each generation wrote further from the source, like ripples moving outward from a single unseen impact. Somewhere at the center lies the truth too old, too quiet, too symmetrical to fit into history. The more we study the past, the older Egypt becomes. Beneath every known dynasty waits another foundation, carved deeper, eroded further, older than the myths that claim it. The Sphinx wears the weather of forgotten rain. The pyramids align to stars that no longer rise where they once did. Even the hieroglyphs, those patient signs of bird and reed and sun, speak of a language that arrived complete, already knowing the grammar of heaven. Modern science calls it coincidence, geometry, adaptation. But to stand before these structures in silence is to feel the scale of an intelligence that measured time differently. The pyramids do not seem built for their era, they seem built against it, as if designed to survive the loss of all others. Their proportions echo constants of the Earth itself, pi, phi, and the tilt of its axis. Their orientation holds north truer than the compasses that came after. Their corridors mirror the angles of starlight, long since shifted by precession. They are not just monuments, they are instruments still operating, still aligned to a sky that no longer exists. Perhaps that was the point. To leave something that outlasts understanding. To construct a record not in words, but in weight and direction. A civilization that knew it would vanish could only speak through endurance. The flood may have erased its cities, the desert may have buried its roads, but stone remembers. The myths of the first time say that when the gods departed, they left behind the measure of all things. The priests believed it meant proportion, the divine ratio that binds form to meaning. To a modern eye, it looks like architecture. To them, it was language, a way of speaking to eternity through alignment. Every temple, every wall, every hieroglyph was part of a single equation written across the Nile Valley. Heaven reflected on earth. Today, satellites scan what the eyes cannot see. They find tunnels under Giza, geometric grids beneath the sand, submerged platforms off the coast. The fragments connect like parts of a pattern too large to grasp. Each discovery pushes the boundary of Egypt's beginning further back, into climates, epochs, and skies no human memory should reach. Yet the design remains unchanged, patient, as if waiting to be recognized. To ask whether Egypt inherited the pyramids is to ask whether time itself has layers. Civilizations rise and fall, but knowledge moves differently. It burrows, survives in ritual, hides in architecture, and resurfaces as intuition. The builders may be gone, their names erased, their tools forgotten, but the geometry endures encoded in temples, in ratios, in the distances between stars. At dusk, the desert cools and the wind fades. The limestone breathes out the heat of day. In that stillness, the pyramids no longer seem ancient, they seem outside of age. The sky drifts, the constellations shift, but the stones remain in perfect correspondence with an order older than the human story. Perhaps that is Egypt's final message, that history is not a line, but a circle, that what we call beginnings are only returns, and that somewhere, beneath the sand, beneath the centuries, beneath even the idea of civilization, there is a memory still intact, measuring, watching, waiting for time to remember itself. The pyramids no longer speak, yet they continue to measure something: time, silence, or perhaps our own curiosity. Every block, every angle, every alignment points to a memory older than history, a story written in stone instead of words. If Egypt truly inherited its wonders, then what else might the earth still remember beneath its deserts and seas? These questions will never rush to answer themselves. They wait quietly for those who still listen. If you've stayed with us through this journey into forgotten ages, thank you. For more nights spent in the half-light of lost worlds, subscribe. Let the next story find you slowly, where time softens and history begins to dream again.